Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready for another deep dive into the latest Bitcoin buzz?
Always. Seems like there's never a dull moment.
You can say that again. So, anyone who's been following Bitcoin knows it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride lately, especially this past week.
Definitely.
We've got a stack of fresh articles from Cointelegraph here, and it seems like there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, let's dive in.
First things first, Bitcoin dipped below $59,000 this week. What's the deal with that?
Well, a couple of things are playing into it. One factor is inflation. The U.S. inflation numbers came in higher than expected.
So everyone's feeling the pinch,
Pretty much. And when prices go up, people get a little worried about, well, everything.
especially the economy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that has a knock-on effect on, investor confidence.
Makes sense. The Cointelegraph articles also mentioned something about interest rates.
Right. So the U.S. Federal Reserve, or the Fed as it's called, they're the ones who set interest rates. And there's a lot of speculation about whether they'll raise rates again soon.
So how does that tie back to Bitcoin?
Well, when interest rates go up, other types of investments, like bonds, they start to look a bit more appealing. They're seen as, I guess, a bit safer.
Safer than Bitcoin.
Yeah, at least traditionally, Bitcoin is still, the new kid on the block in many ways. So in times of economic uncertainty, some investors get a little hesitant to put their money into riskier assets.
And Bitcoin definitely falls into that riskier category for some people.
For sure. It's volatile, but, that volatility is also what makes it exciting for others.
True. High risk, high reward, as they say.
Exactly.
The articles also pointed to the latest U.S. jobless claims numbers.
Yeah, those weren't exactly encouraging. Reached a 14-month high.
Not great. So we've got inflation worries, potential interest rate hikes, and now some not-so-hot job numbers. That's got to be making some Bitcoin investors a little jittery, right?
Definitely adds to the uncertainty. And when investors get nervous, they tend to pull back from riskier assets. It's kind of a natural reaction.
Like a flight to safety.
Something like that. But here's the thing. Even with all that economic uncertainty swirling around, Bitcoin is still holding its own.
That's true. It hasn't completely tanked.
Exactly. And that speaks to its, I guess, resilience as an asset. It marches to the beat of its own drum to some extent.
Which is what people love about it. Okay, so we've got these big picture economic forces at play. But the Cointelegraph articles also mention some interesting moves happening with Bitcoin derivatives. Specifically, a huge amount of Bitcoin was moved onto exchanges recently.
Oh yeah, that definitely caught my eye. Over 63,000 Bitcoin, something like $1.83 billion worth, flowed into exchanges starting on October 7th.
Wow, so that's got to mean something, right? People don't just move that much Bitcoin around for no reason.
It's definitely something to pay attention to. It could mean that some big players are getting ready to sell.
Which usually pushes the price down.
Right. But, and this is important, exchange inflows don't always tell the whole story. It's not a foolproof indicator.
So how do we figure out what's really going on?
We got to dig a little deeper, look at some other data points, things like the Bitcoin futures premium.
Okay, you lost me. What in the world is a Bitcoin futures premium?
So imagine you want to buy tickets to a really popular concert.
Okay, I'm following.
You could buy those tickets right now at face value, or you could buy what's called a futures contract.
Which is basically like a promise to sell you the ticket on the day of the concert.
You got it. And just like with those concert tickets, the price of those future Bitcoin contracts can fluctuate. Sometimes they're priced higher than the current Bitcoin price, indicating that traders think the price will go up. That's the premium.
I see. So it's like they're betting on whether Bitcoin will be worth more or less in the future.
Exactly. And usually we see this premium sitting somewhere between 5% and 10%.
And what are we seeing now?
Well, that's the thing. It's dipped below 5% recently.
Oh, so that's why people are paying attention.
It's definitely raising some eyebrows. A shrinking premium can be a sign that big players are, well, maybe getting ready to sell. It's like they're not as confident that the price will keep going up.
Okay, so that's one piece of the puzzle, but you said it's not the whole story.
Right. We also need to look at what options traders are doing.
Options traders. Now we're really getting into the weeds.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Think of options traders as having access to a special kind of insurance against Bitcoin's price movements.
Insurance. Tell me more.
So they can basically buy or sell contracts that give them the right, but not the obligation, to buy or sell Bitcoin at a certain price in the future.
Okay, so it's like hedging their bets.
Exactly. They're protecting themselves whether the price goes up or down.
Smart. So what are these options traders telling us?
Well, they haven't exactly been hitting the panic button, which is interesting. There's something called the 25% delta skew.
Don't even try to explain that one. I'm already lost.
Basically, it measures how much they're willing to pay for that insurance against a potential price drop.
Okay, so if they're buying lots of insurance, it means they're really worried about the price crashing.
You got it. But right now, that 25% delta skew is hovering around zero,
Meaning,
meaning they're not rushing to buy that insurance. It's almost like they're not as concerned about a major downturn as the futures market might suggest.
so it's like mixed signals from the derivatives market. Futures are flashing yellow, but options are still pretty chill.
It's definitely a mixed bag, and that's why it's so important to look at all angles, consider all the data before jumping to any conclusions.
You've given us a lot to think about already. But there's another big event looming on the horizon that could really throw a wrench into things, the U.S. election.
Ah, yes, the election. Always good for a bit of market speculation.
Right. Both candidates have been saying some pretty interesting things about crypto, but how much will it actually impact Bitcoin's price? I mean, crypto analyst Dan Tapiero seems to think we're headed to $100,000 regardless of who wins.
$100,000, huh? Well, predicting the future of Bitcoin is a fool's errand, as I'm sure you know. But it is interesting to see how the crypto community is reacting to the election.
There's definitely a lot of buzz, that's for sure.
For good reason. Crypto regulation is a hot topic right now, and the outcome of the election could have a big impact on how Bitcoin and other digital assets are treated here in the U.S.
So are we talking tighter regulations, looser regulations? What's the general vibe?
It's hard to say for sure. Both candidates have different stances on cryptocurrency, and their approaches to regulation could vary widely.
So more uncertainty, just what the crypto market loves.
You said it. But here's the thing to remember. Bitcoin's rise is part of a much larger trend.
Which is?
The global shift towards blockchain technology. This isn't just a U.S. phenomenon. It's happening all over the world.
So even if the U.S. decides to clamp down on crypto, it's not necessarily game over.
Not at all. Bitcoin is decentralized, remember? It's not controlled by any one government or institution. That's a big part of its appeal.
It's like its own little independent nation existing in the digital ether.
In a way, yes. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind, especially in light of the election.
Okay, so we've got a lot to consider. We've got the U.S. election potentially shaking things up on the regulatory front. We've got these interesting moves happening in the derivatives market. And then, of course, we've got the overall economic backdrop, which is, well, let's just say it's a bit of a mixed bag right now.
That's a pretty good summary. It's a lot to process.
It is. But before we get too overwhelmed, maybe we can try to break it down a little bit. What are some key things that our listeners should keep in mind as they navigate this wild world of Bitcoin?
You mean besides tuning into this podcast?
Besides that, of course, though that's always a good idea.
Okay, in all seriousness, I think the most important thing is to remember that knowledge is power. The more you understand the factors that are influencing Bitcoin's price, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions.
So do your research. Don't just jump in blindly.
Exactly. There's a lot of information out there. News sites like Cointelegraph are a great resource, and there are tons of online communities where you can learn from other crypto enthusiasts.
It's like anything else, the more you know, the less intimidating it becomes.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to ask questions. There are no stupid questions when it comes to crypto. We're all still learning here.
Speaking of learning, we've covered a lot of ground already, but we're not done yet. We still need to talk about that massive stash of Bitcoin the U.S. government is sitting on. You know, the one from the Silk Road bust?
Ah, yes, the Silk Road stash. It's like a ticking time bomb in the crypto world. No one knows for sure what the government is going to do with it.
It's true. It's like they're holding a royal flush in the crypto casino, and nobody knows if they'll fold or go all in.
That's one way to put it.
But seriously, we're talking about nearly 70,000 Bitcoin. That's a huge chunk of change, even for the U.S. government.
It's more Bitcoin than many of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges hold.
Wow. I hadn't thought about it like that.
It's a big deal. And it has the potential to really shake things up depending on what the government decides to do.
So what are the options? What could they do with all that Bitcoin?
Well, they could sell it, of course.
Which, let's be honest, is what a lot of people think they'll probably do eventually.
It wouldn't be surprising. But a massive government-led sell-off like that could have a big impact on the market.
Like send the price plummeting.
It's definitely possible, especially in the short term. But it could also backfire.
How so?
Well, some people argue that a big sell-off like that could actually be a good thing for Bitcoin in the long run.
Really? How do you figure that?
Because it would demonstrate that Bitcoin is a legitimate asset.
Hmm. That's an interesting take. Like, if the government is willing to sell it, it must be worth something, right?
Exactly. And that could attract more institutional investors who have been hesitant to get involved in the crypto market up to this point.
So it's a gamble, really. No one knows for sure how it would play out.
That's the nature of the game, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
You got that right. Okay, so the government holding all that Bitcoin is like a big question mark hanging over the market.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity.
Speaking of complexity, let's circle back to the election. We talked about how the candidates' stances on crypto regulation could impact Bitcoin's price. But how much weight should we really give that? Is it possible we're overthinking it?
It's a valid question. You know, Bitcoin has a history of surprising us. It's gone through cycles of boom and bust before, often driven by factors that had nothing to do with government policies or regulations.
True. It's like it has a mind of its own sometimes.
Exactly. It's this decentralized global phenomenon, and that's easy to forget when we get caught up in the day-to-day news cycle.
So you're saying we shouldn't get too caught up in the election hype.
Not necessarily. It's definitely important to stay informed about potential policy changes that could impact the crypto space. But it's equally important to remember that Bitcoin's story is bigger than any one country or any single election.
It's a good point. It's global. It's like trying to contain the internet.
Precisely. So, while the election outcome might cause some short-term volatility, it's unlikely to derail Bitcoin's long-term trajectory. At least that's my take.
That's reassuring in a way. It's good to be reminded that Bitcoin has weathered storms before.
It's weathered quite a few,
Yeah.
and it's come out stronger on the other side.
So what's the key takeaway here for our listeners? What should they be focusing on amidst all this noise?
Well, if I had to boil it down to one thing, I'd say focus on the fundamentals,
The fundamentals, like what?
like the underlying technology behind Bitcoin, the blockchain. Understand how it works, why it matters, and what problems it has the potential to solve. Because ultimately, that's what's going to drive Bitcoin's long-term success.
It's not just about the price, it's about the potential, right?
Exactly. The price is just a reflection of that potential. And right now, I think that potential is bigger than ever.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the election, we've talked about the Silk Road Bitcoin stash, we've talked about the importance of focusing on the
I've
fundamentals.
covered a lot of ground.
We have. But before we wrap things up, I want to touch on one more thing that stood out to me from the Cointelegraph articles. It's something that I think a lot of people are wondering about.
And what's that?
What does all of this mean for the average person who's just starting to dip their toes into the crypto waters?
Ah, yes, the newcomers. It can be a little overwhelming at first, can't it?
To say the least. It's a whole new world with its own language and its own set of rules.
It's true, but it's also an incredibly exciting time to be getting involved.
I agree. So what advice would you give to someone who's just starting out?
I'd say, first and foremost, don't be intimidated.
Easier said than done.
You don't know, I know. But there are tons of resources available to help you learn the ropes. And the crypto community is actually very welcoming for the most part. People are generally happy to help newcomers.
That's good to hear.
And remember, you don't have to go all in right away. Start small, learn as you go, and only invest what you can afford to lose.
That's probably good advice for any investment, not just crypto.
You're absolutely right.
So where's a good place for someone to start their crypto journey?
Well, reading articles like the ones we've been discussing from Cointelegraph is a great start. They do a good job of breaking down complex topics into digestible chunks.
They do. They're a great resource.
And as I mentioned earlier, there are tons of online communities dedicated to all things crypto. Reddit, Twitter, even Discord, they all have thriving crypto communities where you can connect with other enthusiasts, ask questions, and stay up to date on the latest developments.
And a lot of those communities have like dedicated channels or subreddits for beginners, right?
Exactly. So don't be afraid to jump in and start asking questions. Everyone was new to this once.
It's true. We all start somewhere.
Exactly. The most important thing is to be curious, be cautious, and be patient.
Curious, cautious, and patient. I like that. Any final thoughts before we wrap up this deep dive?
Just one. The world of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is constantly changing. What's true today might not be true tomorrow.
It's the nature of the beast, right?
Exactly. So stay informed, stay adaptable, and most importantly, enjoy the ride.
Enjoy the ride. I love it. Enjoy the ride. Words to live by, especially in the crypto world.
You know it.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground today, from those nerve-wracking economic indicators to the election buzz to that massive pile of Silk Road Bitcoin just sitting there.
It's a lot to digest.
It really is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, any parting words of wisdom for our listeners? What's the one big takeaway you hope they walk away with?
That's a tough one. I guess if I had to choose, I'd say don't get so caught up in the day-to-day price swings that you lose sight of the bigger picture.
A bigger picture being.
The potential of blockchain technology to revolutionize, well, pretty much everything. Bitcoin is just one piece of that puzzle.
It's easy to forget that when you're glued to the charts, watching your portfolio go up and down.
It's true. But it's important to remember that we're still in the early innings of this whole crypto revolution.
So buckle up.
Exactly. It's going to be a wild ride. But if you're informed, if you're cautious, and if you believe in the long-term potential of this technology, then I think you're going to be just fine.
Music to my ears.
Well, on that note, I think we've earned ourselves a break. A big thank you to our expert for breaking it all down for us.
Anytime.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Bitcoin. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.